The architecture of a multi is never truly protected by high-security steel vaults, encrypted digital servers, or armed security guards. It is protected entirely by the fragile, quiet geometry of a single sheet of parchment paper. In the elite, old-money circles of Manhattan, where historic brownstone mansions overlook the frosted expanses of Central Park and family lineages are treated like sovereign empires, a marriage is rarely a union of two souls. It is a calculated, high-stakes corporate merger. And in every multi-billion-dollar merger, there is always a silent, patient predator waiting in the shadows for the perfect moment of vulnerability to strike. My name is Evelyn Vance. For 10 long, immaculate years, my life within the historic, limestone walls of the Vance estate in the Upper East Side was considered the absolute gold standard of high society elegance and domestic bliss. My late father, Arthur Vance, was the undisputed patriarch of a real estate shipping empire that practically owned the iconic New York skyline. He was a man of iron will, whose single nod could greenlight skyscrapers and reshape the financial districts of the world. When I chose to marry Julian, a brilliant, deceptively charming corporate litigator who climbed his way up from a penniless, working-class background, my father didn't see a loving son-in-law. He saw a massive financial liability. To secure the untouched, generational legacy of our family name, my father forced Julian to sign a ruthless, prenuptial agreement valued at exactly $100 million before a single wedding invitation was sent out. The legal terms of that document were absolute, unforgiving, and designed to destroy any fortune-hunting interloper. If Julian ever initiated a divorce, or if any marital infidelity was legally proven against him, he would walk away from my family empire with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back. He would be legally stripped of every asset, every stock option, and every connection to the Vance name. I vividly remember the night before our lavish, high-society wedding. In the dim, amber-lit sanctuary of my father's private library, surrounded by thousands of rare, leather-bound volumes and the heavy, expensive scent of premium Cuban tobacco, Julian sat quietly at the heavy mahogany desk. I watched him unscrew his vintage gold fountain pen, his face a perfect mask of calm humility, and press his signature firmly onto the paper. Our lifelong family lawyer, a trusted, silver-haired man named Richard who had served my father for 3 decades and held the keys to our entire corporate vault, witnessed the signature and locked the document deep inside the master safe. Julian looked up at me that night, his hazel eyes filled with what looked like pure devotion, and whispered, "I don't care about the wealth, Evelyn. I don't care about the real estate or the legacy. I only care about you." For a decade, I believed that beautiful whisper. We became Manhattan's ultimate golden couple, untouchable, flawless, and completely envied by the upper crust of society. But the perfect architecture of our false truth began to peel at the edges, revealing the calculated horror underneath. The exact moment my father's powerful heart stopped beating on a freezing winter morning. The winter of 2026 brought an unnatural, suffocating gray fog that settled heavily over New York, turning the skyscraper glass into cold, unreadable mirrors. My father passed away suddenly from a massive, unpredictable myocardial infarction in his sleep, leaving the entire Vance empire resting on my shoulders. The funeral was a grand, somber affair attended by international billionaires, city politicians, and the cultural elite. But before the soil on my father's grave could even freeze, the man I had shared a bed with for 10 years underwent a sudden, terrifying transformation. Exactly 3 days after the funeral concluded, Julian did not return home for our scheduled family dinner. Instead, a corporate courier arrived at the limestone gates of the Vance estate, delivering a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the crest of New York's most aggressive luxury divorce law firm. Inside was a formal petition for divorce, filed by Julian's newly retained legal defense team. The legal demands were monstrous, to drain the lifeblood out of our family. Julian was claiming 50% of the entire Vance real estate portfolio, full custody of our 7-year-old daughter, Maya, and immediate operational control over the family's primary charitable foundations. There was no explanation, no prior argument, no emotional breakdown. It was a cold, bloodless corporate raid on my inheritance. I sat alone in the empty, cavernous kitchen of the estate, the divorce papers trembling in my cold hands, a wave of profound disbelief washing over me. I dialed Julian's personal cell phone immediately, but my calls were instantly forwarded straight to his corporate assistant. When I finally cornered him the next morning at the grand, glass-walled executive offices of his law firm Midtown, he didn't look like the humble, loving man I had married in my father's library. He looked like a triumphant general preparing to claim a conquered territory. "You're insane, Julian," I said, voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage, echoing off the minimalist glass walls of the conference room. "Have you forgotten what you signed in my father's library 10 years ago? The prenuptial agreement is ironclad. It has been reviewed by the top contract scholars in the state. If you walk away from this marriage, you leave with absolutely nothing. You will not touch a single square inch of my father's real estate, and you will certainly never take Maya away from me." Julian slowly leaned back in his black leather executive chair, laced his long fingers together with terrifying calm, and let out a soft, mocking laugh that sent an icy shiver straight down my spine. He looked at me not with anger, but with a deeply unsettling pity. "The prenuptial agreement? Oh, Evelyn, you are welcome to present that document to the New York Supreme Court," Julian said, his voice smooth, devoid of any human warmth. "But I assure you, you have absolute in this room, or any other room in this city." Driven by a sudden, choking wave of primal panic, I rushed out of the Midtown skyscraper and drove frantically back to the Upper East Side mansion. I sprinted down the grand spiral staircase to the secure basement vault, my fingers frantically typing the dual biometric and digital codes into my father's private wall safe. The heavy steel door clicked open with a muffled mechanical groan. I reached inside, my heart hammering against my ribs, and grabbed the blue velvet folder that contained the original, signed prenuptial agreement from 10 years ago. I pulled out the heavy parchment paper, my eyes racing down past the paragraphs of text, skipping straight to the final execution page where Julian's signature, Richard's witness stamp, and my father's authorization should have been immortalized. The page was entirely, terrifyingly blank. There was no blue ink. There was no signature. There was no witness. The lines where the names had been written were completely white, pristine, and clean, as if a fountain pen had never once touched the surface of the paper in human history. 10 years of absolute legal protection, 10 years of my father's careful security planning, had completely vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but an empty mockery of a piece of parchment. The New York Supreme Court held its preliminary marital asset hearing 2 weeks later. The courtroom was a grand, oak-paneled hall filled with the quiet rustle of legal briefs and the cold indifference of institutional law. I stood before the presiding judge, desperate, pale, and exhausted, as my newly hired legal team presented the blank document. We claimed that the original signature had been maliciously tampered with, erased, or chemically altered by an outside party. Julian's high-priced defense lawyers didn't even look bothered to stand up. They calmly presented the court with the files retrieved directly from our family lawyer Richard's secured corporate database. The digital scans of the prenuptial agreement, uploaded 10 years ago on the night of our wedding, were also completely blank. There was no digital footprint of a signature anywhere in the system. "Your Honor," Julian's lead attorney stated smoothly, addressing the bench with a practiced, arrogant authority. "The Vance family has been holding a blank piece of paper for a decade. There is no biological, physical, or digital evidence that my client ever agreed to these absurd financial restrictions. This prenuptial agreement is a total myth, an empty threat used by the late Arthur Vance to psychologically control a young lawyer. The document is legally non-existent. We cannot divide an estate based on a ghost." The judge adjusted his glasses, looked at the blank parchment document resting on the evidence table, sighed, and looked at me with a mixture of boredom. "The court cannot enforce a financial contract that possesses no signatures or witness verifications, Mrs. Vance," the judge stated, bringing down his gavel with a dull thud. "Unless your legal team can present immediate physical proof of execution, the prenuptial agreement is officially dismissed from these proceedings. We will proceed with the standard statutory division of all marital assets, including the Vance real estate trusts." With that single stroke of a gavel, Julian had successfully used the legal system to freeze my personal banking accounts, place a permanent corporate lien on the Upper East Side mansion, and file an emergency injunction restricting my daily access to Maya. I was being systematically, legally stripped of my life, my fortune, my identity, and my child inside my own home, while the man who stole it all smiled at his attorneys across the aisle. But a Vance does not surrender to a thief. An active investigation wasn't just a choice, it was the only path to survival. I knew Julian had signed that paper. I had stood 3 feet away from him. I had smelled the ink. I had seen the physical pressure of his hand against the parchment fibers. Ink does not simply evaporate into nothingness without a deliberate, scientific intervention. There was a hidden architecture to this deceit, and I was going to rip it open with my bare hands. I returned to the empty, ignoring the cold, silent stares of the household staff, who were already beginning to realize that Julian was the new master of the estate. I locked myself inside my father's private library, the room where the forgery had been executed 10 years prior. I sat in his leather chair, staring at the mahogany desk, forcing my brain to lungjing lie, to calm down, to strip away the panic and analyze the problem like a chess grandmaster. Julian was a corporate litigator, not a chemist. He couldn't have developed an erasing agent without leaving chemical burns or stains on the fragile parchment paper. The paper was clean. This meant the alteration didn't happen after the signing. It happened during the signing. The ink itself was the weapon. I bypassed the main desk and approached the antique mahogany bookshelves that lined the western wall of the library. I was hunting for anomalies, small, jarring disruptions in the routine of the house that had occurred during the months leading up to my wedding 10 years ago. My father was a meticulous record keeper. He kept every receipt, every memo, and every shipment log in archived leather ledgers. I began pulling down the financial ledgers and personal journals from October 2016. For 6 agonizing hours, I flipped through pages of shipping manifests, estate maintenance bills, and art appraisal documents. My fingers were covered in dust, my eyes burning under the dim light of the library lamp. And then, labeled real estate folder from the final week of October 2016. A small, laminated receipt slipped out from between the heavy bond pages. It was an international banking invoice from an exclusive, highly secretive chemical research laboratory based in Zurich, Switzerland. The date on the invoice was October 24th, 2010, exactly 7 days before my wedding. The item purchased was a highly specialized, industrial-grade compound known as N-phenolphthalein disappearing medium, a rare chemical formulation used primarily in deep-cover espionage and high-level sovereign document forgery. The receipt wasn't made out to my father. It hadn't come from his accounts. It was billed directly to a private shell corporation owned by Richard, our trusted family lawyer. The architecture of the betrayal became instantly, brutally clear. Richard, the man who had sat at our family dinner table for 30 years, the man who had hand planning, had been bought by Julian a decade ago. Julian had promised him a massive share of the empire once my father passed. Together, they had loaded Julian's vintage fountain pen with an ink designed to remain perfectly visible for exactly 5 years before slowly, molecularly destabilizing when exposed to the ambient humidity and low oxygen environment of our family safe. It was designed to leave the document entirely blank by the time my father died, ensuring there would be no evidence left to challenge Julian's claim to the fortune. The next morning, under the cover of a blinding, historic Manhattan snowstorm that kept the city streets empty and dark, I took the blank prenuptial agreement, locked it inside a steel briefcase, and drove secretly to the Federal Forensic and Biological Analysis Laboratories in Queens. Through a high-ranking retired federal contact of my late father, I managed to secure an emergency private consultation with Dr. Avery, a legendary senior forensic document examiner who had spent analyzing counterfeit currency, forged international treaties, and black market documents for the government. Inside the sterile, white-lit laboratory, surrounded by multimillion-dollar electron microscopes, mass spectrometers, and spectral imaging analyzers, Dr. Avery placed the blank parchment document under a high-intensity ultraviolet light source. He adjusted the digital magnification lenses, leaning in close, his face turning into a mask of intense, academic concentration. "Look closely right here, Evelyn," Dr. Avery said. stepping aside and gesturing for me to look through the secondary digital viewfinder of the microscope. As I pressed my eye to the lens, the blank white surface of the paper transformed under the specific spectrum of light. I didn't see ink, but I saw something else. Faint, microscopic, jagged indentations carved deep into the cellulose fibers of the paper. It was the physical track left by the of Julian's fountain pen 10 years ago. The structural pressure of his hand was still there, embedded in the skeleton of the paper, but the chemical matter that made it visible to the human eye was completely gone. The compound they used is terrifyingly brilliant, Dr. Avery muttered, typing furiously on his terminal as a gas chromatography machine analyzed a microscopic scraping from the edge of the line. It's a thermal-sensitive, pH-dependent synthetic ink. It reacts to the stagnant oxygen levels inside a sealed safe over a prolonged period, causing the carbon pigments to alter their light-absorbing properties. To the human eye, to standard digital scanners, and even to basic courtroom verification lights, the paper looks entirely untouched. It's a perfect erasure. "Can you fix it, Marcus?" I asked, my voice tight with a desperate, suffocating pressure. "Can you make the signature come back? I need to present this to the Supreme Court before liquidation hearing next Friday. If I don't have his signature, I lose everything." Dr. Avery stepped back from the machine, rubbing his tired eyes, a somber, defeated look on his face. "The chemistry of this specific Swiss compound has one fatal structural flaw, Evelyn. It doesn't actually disappear from the paper. The molecules simply align themselves parallel to the paper fibers, so they reflect light instead of absorbing it. If you subject this exact piece of parchment to extreme, rapid thermal contraction, specifically an environmental temperature below -25 degrees Celsius, for a continuous, uninterrupted period of 48 hours, the molecular bonds will break. The chemical ink will instantly expand, locking back into its original crystalline state. The signature will reappear in a bright, permanent indigo blue that can never be erased or altered again." A sudden spark of absolute hope ignited in my chest. "Then do it in your laboratory freezers right now. Let's freeze the document and take it to the judge." "I can't, Evelyn." Dr. Avery sighed heavily, pointing to a red alert flash on his legal terminal. "Julian's luxury legal team filed a federal asset preservation order this morning across every major lab in the state. Because this prenuptial agreement is part of an active, contested multimillion-dollar divorce proceeding, I am legally barred from performing any destructive, chemical, or thermal testing on this document without a joint court order or a signed release from Julian himself. If I put this paper in a freezer without his consent, the evidence is legally poisoned. Julian will have it thrown out instantly, and I will lose my federal license. His legal architecture has blocked every single exit. Julian had blocked the legal paths. He had frozen the labs, and he had used my own father's wealth to build a flawless, unshakable cage around me, a lawyer balancing risk and reward on a spreadsheet. He believed that because he controlled the law, he controlled reality. But he forgot that a wolf is only safe as long as it stays out of the woods. I realized that fighting Julian inside a standard, sterile New York courtroom was a guaranteed path to destruction. He was a master of procedural delay. He knew how to manipulate judges, suppress forensic findings, and exploit loopholes. To beat a predator of his caliber, you have to lure him out of his concrete courtroom and into an environment where his own massive arrogance becomes his executioner. I waited until Wednesday evening. I went to a crowded train station in Queens and purchased a temporary burner phone using cash. I dialed Richard, our family lawyer, knowing he would be sitting in his luxury office downtown, counting his billable hours. "Richard?" I said, keeping my voice sounding completely broken, frightened. I let out a soft, rehearsed sob into the microphone. "I know what you and Julian did. I found the receipt for the Swiss ink in my father's old files. But I am tired, Richard. I am so tired of fighting. Julian has frozen every single one of my accounts. My legal team is threatening to abandon me due to non-payment, and the press is destroying my family name. I want to propose a private, total settlement before the final court hearing on Friday morning." There was a long, cold pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Richard shifting in his leather chair, his greedy mind instantly calculating the massive financial windfall of an early, uncontested surrender. "A settlement, Evelyn?" Richard asked, his voice dripping with a disgusting, false paternal warmth. "That is a very wise choice. There is no need to drag the Vance name through a public trial. What are your terms?" "I will give Julie of the entire real estate portfolio and sole operational control of the downtown commercial shipping terminals," I said, making my voice tremble perfectly on cue. "Provided he signs a binding non-disclosure agreement and gives me full, uncontested custody of Maya. I just want my daughter, Richard. Let's meet at my father's historic wine cellar in the Hudson Valley mansion tomorrow night. Just you, me, and Julian. No outside lawyers, no media, no court reporters. We sign the final transfer papers, and we end this nightmare privately." "And what about the prenuptial agreement you hold?" Richard asked, his voice narrowing with suspicion. "Bring it with you?" I whispered, wiping away a fake tear. "Bring the original blank prenuptial agreement from your safe. I want to burn it in front of Julian's face the moment I sign the new transfer documents. I want to look him in the eyes and know that my father's grip on our lives is fine." "Of course, child," Richard said, a triumphant gleam evident in his tone. "I will convey this to Julian immediately. I am certain he will agree to a peaceful, highly profitable resolution. We will see you at the Hudson Valley estate at exactly 8 p.m. tomorrow night." They thought I was a broken, wounded bird crawling back into its cage. They had no idea that the historic Hudson Valley estate held a very specific industrial secret that my father had built for his own preservation. The Vance estate in the Hudson Valley was a massive, secluded stone fortress built by my grandfather during the height of the Cold War in the 1950s. Perched on a cliff overlooking the frozen Hudson River, it was completely isolated from the main roads, surrounded by miles of dense pine forest. Beneath the grand timber dining hall lay a state-of-the-art, underground wine cellar capable of holding over 20,000 vintage bottles. Because my father collected delicate French and Italian wines that required highly specific, sub-zero preservation protocols to prevent structural cork degradation, he had installed an industrial-grade, commercial refrigeration walk-in vault deep inside the stone foundations. It wasn't a standard residential wine cellar. It was a sub-zero fortress controlled by a heavy, external digital thermostat panel hidden behind a secret wood panel in the hallway. The system was powered by dedicated diesel generators, capable of dropping the interior temperature of the stone tasting room to -30 degrees Celsius within minutes. I arrived at the isolated estate 12 hours before the scheduled meeting. The house was cold, empty, and silent, wrapped in a blanket of fresh snow. I walked down into the dark, stone-lined vaults of the cellar, the air crisp and smelling of old oak barrels and damp earth. I approached the digital control panel, bypassed the automated factory safety limits using my father's override code, and set the ambient temperature inside the main tasting room to exactly -28 degrees Celsius. Next, I went to work preparing the trap. I hid 3 high-definition, military-grade thermal cameras inside the heavy, wrought iron light fixtures hanging from the stone ceiling. These specialized cameras weren't just recording standard video. They were broadcasting a live, highly encrypted digital stream directly to the private, secure servers of the New York District Attorney's white-collar crime task force, whom I had secretly briefed through my father's old federal connections the night before. I told them to wait in unmarked surveillance vehicles 3 miles down the main highway until they received my live signal. At exactly 7:45 p.m., the bright halogen headlights of a luxury SUV illuminated the frozen, snow-covered driveway of the estate. Julian and Richard stepped out of the vehicle, wrapped in heavy, expensive wool coats, their faces filled with absolute confidence and smug. They walked through the grand, echoing front doors of the mansion without knocking and descended the stone stairs into the dark wine cellar. As they stepped into the main tasting room, Julian looked around the massive stone vault, a cold, predatory smile cutting across his lips. The air inside the room was already freezing, our breath forming thick, white clouds under the dim glow of the chandelier. "It's freezing down here, Evelyn," Julian said, his voice echoing off the stone as he pulled his leather gloves tighter around his fingers. "Let's make this quick. Show us the new asset transfer documents, we sign them, and we burn that pathetic piece of parchment so we can all go home. Richard stepped forward, opening his heavy alligator skin briefcase and pulling out the original, blank prenuptial agreement from 10 years ago. He laid it flat on the heavy oak tasting table directly under the glaring light of the chandelier. "Here it is," Richard said, his voice dripping with professional condescension. "The blank canvas of your father's arrogance. $100 million piece of garbage." I stood on the opposite side, my hands tucked deep inside the pockets of my long, dark fur coat. Inside my right pocket, my fingers were tightly clutched around my personal smartphone. The screen was black, but the line was completely open, actively broadcasting a live audio feed to Detective Harris and the federal agents waiting down the road. "Before I sign over 30% of my father's life work to you, Julian," I said, my voice calm, steady, and entirely devoid of the fear and desperation I had faked on the burner phone. I want to hear it from your own mouth. I want the absolute, unvarnished truth for once in this marriage. You loaded your vintage gold fountain pen with phenolphthalein disappearing medium 10 years ago in this very house. You planned this financial execution before you even stood at the altar and looked into my eyes. Julian let out a sharp, arrogant laugh, leaning his hands flat on the oak table, looking across at me with absolute contempt and psychological dominance. He believed he had won the war, and a winning general loves nothing more than to boast of his strategy. "Does it really matter now, Evelyn?" Julian said, his voice sharp and confident. "Your father is dead and buried. The Supreme Court judge threw this piece of paper out of court. You have absolutely no cards left to play in this game. But yes, since we are ending this partnership privately tonight, I'll give you your closure. I was a brilliant young lawyer making $200,000 a year. They treated me like a glorified servant. He made me sign that humiliating, restrictive contract to protect his precious real estate legacy. He wanted to own me, so I found a chemical way around his legal architecture." Richard chuckled from the corner of the room, taking a slow sip of vintage scotch he had poured from a nearby collection rack. "It was an absolute masterpiece of legal and chemical engineering, Evelyn. I altered the digital file hashes on the law firm's secure backup servers on the wedding night, and Julian simply waited for the ambient light and safe oxygen to slowly dissolve the chemical bonds over a decade. By the time Arthur's heart gave out, the contract was a complete ghost. We didn't break a single statutory law. We simply erased a bad corporate memory. You murdered my father's peace of mind, Julian," I whispered, my eyes locking onto his with an icy intensity. "You stole a decade of my life on false identity. Business is business, sweetheart," Julian said, tapping his leather-gloved fingers impatiently against the blank parchment paper on the table. "Now, stop the dramatic speech and pull out the asset transfer papers. The temperature in this stone room is dropping fast. My jaw is freezing, and I have a victory dinner to attend with my partners downtown." I looked down at the blank piece of parchment resting on the oak table between us. The extreme, industrial sub-zero temperature of the tasting room, now sitting at exactly -28 degrees Celsius, had been working silently on the document for the past 20 minutes. The cellulose fibers of the paper were contracting violently under the intense, freezing thermal pressure. Right under the direct, hot glare of the chandelier bulb, a microscopic, faint tint of deep purple began to bloom like a virus in the exact center of the blank signature line. Richard noticed the chemical. He dropped his crystal glass of scotch, the glass shattering into 100 sharp pieces against the stone floor, the amber liquid freezing almost instantly into a dark glaze on the cold rock. He leaned over the table, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a sudden, absolute, paralyzing terror as he stared at the center of the parchment. "Julian," Richard stammered, his voice trembling violently from both the freezing cold and sudden panic. He pointed a shaking, leather-gloved finger at the table. Look at the goddamn paper." Julian lowered his gaze to the parchment document. The faint purple tint was darkening with terrifying speed, shifting rapidly into a vibrant, undeniable, deep indigo blue. Slowly, methodically, the microscopic carbon chemical crystals inside the paper fibers were expanding, realigning themselves back into their original atomic structure of the sub-zero thermal contraction. Within 2 minutes of continuous freezing, Julian's sweeping, highly distinct, aggressive handwritten signature appeared on the execution line, perfectly clear, completely legible, and beautifully detailed. Next to it, Richard's official corporate witness stamp and personal signature materialized in sharp, dark blue ink that looked as fresh as if it had been written 5 seconds ago. The document was no longer blank. The $100 million prenuptial agreement had returned from the dead, its protective legal architecture fully restored under the freezing air of the Hudson Valley cellar. "What the hell is this magic?" Julian screamed, his calm, sophisticated composure completely shattering into a manic panic as he lunged forward across the table to grab the document. "What did you do to this paper, you crazy bitch?" "I didn't do anything to it, Julian," I said, old, triumphant smile finally breaking across my face as I stepped back from the table. "Science did. The extreme cold under -25 degrees forces your Swiss disappearing ink to contract, crystallize, and reappear permanently. You are looking at the original contract you signed 10 years ago, and you just confessed to the entire fraudulent conspiracy on a live, federal broadcast." Julian's face turned into a twisted mask of pure, primal rage. He realized he had been lured into a trap. He reached into his heavy wool coat jacket, his eyes wild with a sudden, dangerous malice as he stepped around the heavy oak table toward me, cornering me against the stone wall. "You think a piece of paper saves you down here, Evelyn?" Julian roared, his voice bouncing horribly off the stone vault. "No one knows we are in this cellar. I will take this document. I will burn it to ash with my life, and you will sign those asset transfer papers before you leave this room alive. No judge will ever see this ink." "I wouldn't take another step if I were you, Julian," I said quietly, pulling my hands from my fur coat pockets. Before Julian could take a single step around the corner of the table, before his gloved hand could even touch the fabric of my coat, the heavy, reinforced steel security door of the wine vault was blown open with a violent mechanical crash that shook dust from the ceiling. "Federal agents! Nobody move! Put your hands on the wall right now!" The freezing tasting room was instantly flooded with the blinding, overlapping white beams of tactical flashlights. A dozen heavily armed federal agents from the FBI and tactical officers from the New York Police Department stormed into the stone vault, their weapons drawn, their laser sights painting red dots directly across Julian's chest and forehead. They didn't hesitate for a single second. Two tackled Julian to the floor, slamming him face first into the shattered glass and frozen rock, twisting his arms brutally behind his back as heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. Richard dropped to his knees in the corner, weeping, begging, and trembling uncontrollably as an officer secured his hands. Julian spat a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the stone floor, looking up at me through his tangled hair with eyes filled with venomous, desperate hatred. "You think you won, Evelyn? You think this little stunt saves your father's empire?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with desperation as the agents lifted him up. "Go ahead. Take that restored contract to the New York Supreme Court. My luxury defense team will file an immediate motion for total evidence suppression. You lured us into a sub-zero room on private property without a judicial search warrant. This entire sting operation is an unconstitutional setup. The restored paper is fruit of a poisonous tree, and you know the law. I will be out on bail by midnight, and I will destroy your reputation in every newspaper in this country." I walked calmly over to the oak table, picked up the beautifully restored indigo ink prenuptial agreement, and slid it safely inside my briefcase. I walked over to Julian, stopping just inches from his face, my expression completely flat, completely unbothered by his manic threats. "You are a brilliant corporate litigator, Julian, but your arrogance made you blind," I said, my voice dropping into a cold whisper that froze the remaining air in his lungs. "I didn't bring you down here to win a civil divorce case with this paper. I didn't need this document to destroy your life." Julian Kung Lai. His entire body froze against the grip of the federal agents as he looked at me, a sudden wave of profound confusion replacing his rage. What do you mean? Without this paper, you have no case. I knew your expensive lawyers would suppress any physical evidence recovered in this cellar. I continued, leaning down close to his ear. I knew the restored ink would be tied up in procedural appeals and technicalities for the next 5 years. So, I didn't design this trap for the New York Supreme Court, Julian. I designed it for the federal grand jury. I reached over and pointed directly to Julian's left wrist, where he was wearing my late father's vintage Patek Philippe Grand Complication watch, the multi-million-dollar timepiece I had gifted him on our 5th wedding anniversary, a watch he had greedily stolen from my father's private study hours after the funeral concluded. My father didn't just build a real estate shipping empire, Julian. He was a deeply paranoid billionaire who protected his family legacy at all costs. Before he died, after he began to suspect your financial movements, he had the master watchmaker install a biometric microscavenging audio recording device inside the internal mechanical tourbillon movement of that exact watch. It doesn't run on batteries, Julian. It runs entirely on the kinetic movement of your own wrist. Every time your heart beats, every time you move your arm, the recorder stays alive. Julian's eyes widened into giant circles of pure terror, his skin turning a sickly, pale greenish-gray under the tactical lights as he stared down at the ticking gold watch on his arm. That watch has been recording every single conversation you've had for the past 21 days. I said, my voice echoing with absolute, unshakable authority. Every private meeting with your crooked defense lawyers, every discussion about hiding Vance corporate assets in offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and every detail of how you and Richard falsified the digital backup files on the law firm's main servers. But more importantly, Julian, look at the watch face, down, his breath hitching in his throat. The internal recording software has an automated, real-time voice recognition script programmed by my father's security team. To encrypt and send the audio data legally to the federal servers, it required a verbal confirmation of intent, a direct confession of the original crime. The moment you stood over that table 5 minutes ago and proudly bragged about loading your pen with Swiss disappearing ink to erase the contract 10 years ago, your unique vocal frequency matched the biometric trigger. The watch automatically initiated a high-speed satellite upload, transmitting the entire 10-year history of your corporate fraud, wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy straight to the Department of Justice secure server in Washington. Julian let out a broken, high-pitched gasp, his legs completely giving out beneath him as the federal agents dragged his limp body toward the stone stairs. He wasn't facing a standard civil divorce dispute or an asset division battle. He was facing a multi-count federal RICO indictment for corporate conspiracy, extortion, bank fraud, and computer tampering, crimes that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 35 years in a federal maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Richard broke down completely before they even reached the top of the stairs, screaming a full, frantic confession to the arresting officers in a desperate attempt to secure a non-custodial plea deal, while Julian was hauled out into the freezing Hudson Valley night, his head hung low, his entire life completely demolished by the ticking heirloom on his own wrist. The next morning, the New York District Attorney and the federal prosecutors unsealed the official indictment. Julian's prestigious Midtown law firm collapsed within 48 hours as his corporate clients fled the massive scandal. The Supreme Court judge, presented with the federal wiretap data, instantly dismissed Julian's divorce claims, granted me immediate, absolute sole custody, and lifted the freezes on my family. Bank accounts. The Vance real estate empire remained entirely untouched, its massive, sky-high architecture fully secured against the ultimate predator. Now, I stand alone on the grand penthouse balcony of our Upper East Side estate, watching the morning sun break through the Manhattan fog, illuminating the concrete and steel towers my father spent his life building. Maya is playing happily in the garden below, completely safe from the toxic shadow of her father's endless greed. The blank sheets of parchment that the elite use to bind their fortunes are often just fragile illusions, temporary treaties signed by monsters who wear bespoke suits and expensive smiles. But a family legacy built on absolute truth can never be erased from existence, no matter what kind of invisible ink you use to hide the crime. Here at Family Truths, the truth always finds its way back to the surface, even if it has to freeze the entire world.